The small town of Pine Valley nestled in the rolling hills had always been a quiet place, where everyone knew each other and life moved at an unhurried pace. At the edge of town, just where the paved road turned to gravel, stood the Miller family farm. It was here that Rose, a 23-year-old woman with sun-kissed skin and calloused hands, had spent her entire life learning the ways of the land. Most folks in town saw her as just another farm girl, someone who spent her days tending to crops and taking care of livestock. The local troublemakers, a group of young men who hung around the gas station making snide remarks, would often laugh when she drove by in her beaten-up pickup truck. They'd mock her worn overalls and mud-covered boots, calling her country bumpkin and other names that made them feel superior. What these men didn't know was that Rose had inherited more than just farming skills from her grandfather. Every evening, after the day's work was done, she would head down to the old barn where her grandfather had set up a makeshift shooting range. There, she practiced with the same dedication she showed to tending the crops. Her grandfather, a former law enforcement officer, had taught her everything he knew about self-defense and observation skills before he passed away 2 years ago. The summer that year had been particularly dry, and with it came a wave of trouble that no one in Pine Valley could have anticipated. First, it was just rumors from neighboring towns, stories of break-ins at isolated farms, of cattle rustling, and equipment theft. Rose listened carefully to these tales at the local diner, where farmers gathered for their morning coffee. She noticed patterns that others missed, jotting down notes in a small notebook she kept in her pocket. One evening, while checking the fence line at the far end of her property, Rose spotted something unusual. Tire tracks that hadn't been there the day before cut through her field, leading into the woods. Most people would have dismissed it, but Rose's grandfather had taught her to trust her instincts. She followed the tracks, careful to stay hidden among the trees. The discovery she made in those woods would change everything. Hidden in a clearing was a makeshift camp, carefully concealed from aerial view. Rose counted 3 different sets of footprints and noticed fresh cigarette butts scattered around. But what caught her attention were the serial numbers she glimpsed on some crates partially covered by tarps, numbers that matched the equipment stolen from the Johnson farm 2 counties over. As she carefully made her way back to her truck, Rose's mind was already working on a plan. The local sheriff's office was understaffed and overwhelmed, but she had something the criminals didn't expect: intimate knowledge of every creek, trail, and hidden path in these hills. She knew the land like she knew her own heartbeat, and more importantly, she knew how to be patient. That night, instead of heading straight home, Rose drove to the library and began researching recent theft patterns in the surrounding counties. She created a detailed map, marking each incident with dates and details. A pattern emerged, one that pointed to a sophisticated operation that had been terrorizing rural communities across 3 states. The gang was smart, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement, but they had made one crucial mistake: they had chosen to set up their operation in Rose's backyard. As she drove home that evening, the same group of troublemakers at the gas station called out their usual taunts. Rose just smiled and waved, knowing that soon they'd learn what her grandfather had taught her long ago: never judge a book by its cover, and never underestimate a farm girl who's protecting her home. The autumn sunrise painted the sky in shades of amber and rose gold as morning dew sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds. Rose stood at her kitchen window, warming her hands around a steaming cup of coffee, her grandfather's old leather journal open on the table beside her. The pages were filled with his meticulous notes about local terrain and tracking techniques, wisdom that seemed more valuable now than ever before. In the 2 weeks since discovering the hidden camp, Rose had developed a routine that would have made her grandfather proud. By day, she maintained her usual farm duties, tending to the crops and livestock with the same care she always had. But in the growing darkness of the lengthening autumn evenings, she became something else entirely: a silent observer, gathering intelligence on the criminal operation that had taken root in her beloved hills. Through careful observation, she had identified 5 members of the gang. They moved with military precision, suggesting that at least some of them had formal training. Their leader, a tall man with a distinctive limp who the others called Chief, seemed to run their operation like a well-oiled machine. Rose had documented their patterns, their schedules, and most importantly, their mistakes. One crisp morning, while delivering eggs to Mrs. Thompson's bed and breakfast in town, Rose overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two out-of-town guests were discussing a series of robberies that had turned violent in the neighboring county. "They say the gang left a security guard in critical condition," one man whispered over his breakfast plate. "These aren't just ordinary thieves anymore." The news changed everything. Rose knew she needed to act soon, but she couldn't afford to be reckless. That afternoon, she drove to her closest neighbor, old Mr. Chen, who had been her grandfather's best friend and former partner on the force. His eyes grew serious as she laid out her evidence on his kitchen table, photographs taken with her grandfather's old camera, hand-drawn maps marking the gang's movements, and detailed notes about their operations. "Your grandfather would be proud of your thoroughness," Mr. Chen said, examining her work. "But he'd also want you to be careful. These men are dangerous." He pulled out his own notebook and began adding to Rose's notes, sharing insights from his years of experience. Together, they crafted a plan that would require perfect timing and even better execution. The next few days were a blur of careful preparation. Rose spent hours in her grandfather's workshop, servicing the farm's security systems and checking the equipment she'd need. Mr. Chen made discreet calls to trusted former colleagues, setting up a network of support that would be ready when the time came. Every detail had to be perfect, lives depended on it. As she worked, Rose couldn't help but think about the way those men at the gas station still snickered when she drove past. Just yesterday, she'd heard one of them say, "There goes farm girl, probably talking to her chickens again." The comment had rolled off her back like water off a duck's feathers. Let them laugh. Their underestimation of her would make her job easier. One evening, while monitoring the gang's camp from her hidden observation post, Rose witnessed something that confirmed her suspicions about their next target. They were planning to hit the regional agricultural bank during the upcoming harvest festival, when most of the town's farmers would be depositing their seasonal earnings. The timing would have been clever, if Rose hadn't been watching. That night, as clouds rolled in promising the first real rain in weeks, Rose sat at her kitchen table with Mr. Chen, finalizing their strategy. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily as they worked, its rhythm matching the determination in Rose's heart. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind: "Patience is your weapon, knowledge is your shield, and timing is everything." Thunder rumbled in the distance as Rose walked Mr. Chen to his truck. Before leaving, he turned to her with concern in his eyes. "Your grandfather always said you were special, Rose. He knew you had the heart of a protector. Just remember, even the best plans can go sideways. Be ready for anything." As she watched his taillights disappear down the dark road, Rose felt a strange calm settle over her. Tomorrow, she would begin implementing their plan. The gang had no idea that the simple farm girl they dismissed was about to become their worst nightmare. More importantly, they had no idea that the tight-knit farming community they'd targeted was about to show them exactly what country strength looked like. Back inside, Rose opened her grandfather's gun safe and carefully removed his old service weapon. As she cleaned it with practiced precision, the rain finally began to fall, drumming against the roof like nature's own countdown timer. In less than 48 hours, everything would change. The only question was whether the gang would realize their mistake before it was too late. The Harvest Festival was 36 hours away, and Pine Valley hummed with anticipation like a beehive in spring. Farmers' trucks rolled through town loaded with the season's bounty, kicking up dust that caught the morning light like golden mist. But beneath this peaceful scene, Rose felt the tension coiling like a spring ready to snap. She spent the morning doing what appeared to be routine farm work, though each action had its purpose. While checking the irrigation lines near the forest edge, she strategically positioned motion sensors disguised as ordinary farming equipment. As she drove her tractor along the field's perimeter, she was actually mapping out potential escape routes the gang might use. Her grandfather had always said that the best plans were the ones hidden in plain sight. Around noon, Rose made her way into town, her truck bed loaded with fresh produce for the festival. The local troublemakers were in their usual spot at the gas station, but today their taunt seemed distant, unimportant. As she unloaded crates of vegetables at the community center, she carefully observed the bank across the street. The gang's plan suddenly seemed obvious: the festival crowds would provide perfect cover for their operation. Inside the bank, Rose noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. A new security guard stood by the entrance, one she'd never seen before. His stance was too rigid, his eyes too alert. When he shifted his weight, she caught a glimpse of a tattoo on his wrist, the same distinctive pattern she'd seen on one of the gang members at their camp. They already had someone on the inside. During her delivery rounds, Rose stopped at Mr. Chen's house. In his garage, converted into a temporary command center, 3 retired law enforcement officers were reviewing her intelligence. Maps covered the walls, and surveillance equipment hummed quietly in the corner. The old-timers had come out of retirement for this, drawn by Mr. Chen's call and their own sense of duty. The guard changes at midnight, one of the officers noted, studying the bank's security schedule. That's when they'll make their move. They'll want to be in position before the morning rush. Rose shared her discovery about the new security guard, watching as the officers' expressions grew more serious. "They're more embedded than we thought," Mr. Chen mused, rubbing his chin. "We'll need to adjust our timing." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley, Rose returned to her farm for what everyone else would assume was evening chores. In reality, she was making final preparations. In the barn, she checked the equipment one last time: communication devices disguised as ordinary farming radios, night vision goggles hidden in old feed bags, and her grandfather's backup weapons secured in a false panel beneath the floorboards. The sunset painted the sky in deep purples and burning oranges, as if nature itself was setting the stage for what was to come. Rose stood in her kitchen, preparing a simple dinner of fresh bread and homemade soup, when she heard an unexpected sound: tires on gravel, coming up her driveway. Through the window, she saw a black SUV she didn't recognize. 2 men stepped out, wearing suits that might have fooled others but not her. Their shoes were too tactical, their postures too alert. They were members of the gang, probably here to ensure no one would interfere with tomorrow's operation. Rose wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, playing the role of a simple farm girl to perfection. The men introduced themselves as bank representatives, claiming they were visiting local farmers to discuss harvest loans. As she invited them in for coffee, Rose noticed how they scanned her home, probably looking for signs of threat and finding none. All they saw was a modest farmhouse with worn furniture and fresh-cut flowers on the table. Their conversation was a careful dance of questions and half-truths. They were good, she had to admit, but Rose had learned deception from the best. She spoke enthusiastically about the festival, playing up her excitement about the seasonal celebrations while carefully feeding them misinformation about local security preparations. As the men left, seemingly satisfied that she was exactly what she appeared to be, Rose watched their taillights disappear into the gathering dusk. She waited 10 minutes before picking up her secure radio. "They took the bait," she transmitted to Mr. Chen. "They think the additional security will be focused on the festival grounds, not the bank." That night, as crickets sang their evening chorus and a cool breeze rustled through the cornfields, Rose sat on her porch swing, her grandfather's journal in her lap. The weight of tomorrow's operation settled around her shoulders like a familiar blanket. Years of training, countless hours of preparation, all leading to this moment. In less than 24 hours, the gang would learn their greatest mistake wasn't choosing Pine Valley as their target. It was underestimating the quiet farm girl who'd spent her whole life preparing for a moment like this. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Rose allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow, everything would change, and she was ready. The harvest moon hung low and golden in the sky, casting long shadows across Pine Valley as the night before the festival settled in. Rose moved through her farmhouse with practiced silence, her boots barely making a sound on the old wooden floors. Every window she passed showed her reflection, no longer the simple farm girl the town knew, but a shadow warrior prepared for battle. In her grandfather's study, Rose opened an old chest that hadn't been touched in years. Inside lay a tactical vest he'd kept from his service days, modified to fit her frame. As she secured it beneath her familiar denim jacket, she caught her reflection in the vintage mirror above the fireplace. The outfit was a perfect blend of farmer and fighter, exactly what she needed to be tonight. The festival preparations in town had continued until sunset, with locals setting up stalls and decorating the square with twinkling lights and harvest bunting. But now, in the deep of night, a different kind of preparation was underway. Rose's radio crackled softly with updates from Mr. Chen's team, positioned strategically around the bank's perimeter. Movement at the south entrance, came a whispered report. 2 figures, moving like professionals. Rose checked her watch, 11:45 p.m. The gang was right on schedule. From her grandfather's journal, she'd learned that criminals often stuck to precise timing, their military-like precision both a strength and a weakness. Tonight, that predictability would work against them. She slipped out of the house and into the barn, where her modified farm truck waited. Its engine had been carefully tuned to run almost silently, and its bed concealed specialized equipment beneath bales of hay. As she drove toward town, she took the back roads she'd known since childhood, paths that wouldn't appear on any GPS. The town square was eerily beautiful at this hour. Festival decorations swayed gently in the night breeze, and the harvest moon cast everything in a surreal, amber glow. Rose parked her truck behind the old feed store, positioning it for a quick exit if needed. Through her night vision binoculars, she observed the bank's exterior. The fake security guard was still at his post, but his posture had changed, he was expecting company. At precisely midnight, the guard's shift change began. But instead of the regular replacement, 2 more gang members slipped inside. Rose's earpiece crackled with Mr. Chen's voice, 4 more approaching from the east alley. They're carrying heavy equipment. The pieces were falling into place. The gang had chosen the festival night perfectly, not just for the cash deposits, but because the town's police force would be stretched thin managing the celebration. What they didn't know was that every officer had been briefed on Rose's plan, and the festival security was largely for show. Through the bank's windows, Rose could see shadows moving with practiced efficiency. These weren't amateur thieves, their movements showed years of experience. They were probably former military, just as she'd suspected. But they had one critical weakness: their own success had made them arrogant. As she watched, Rose noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the gang members was carrying what looked like explosive charges. They were planning to break into the reinforced vault. If those explosives went off, they could damage half the town square. The stakes had just gotten much higher. Rose keyed her radio, speaking in a whisper. They have explosives. We need to move before they reach the vault. There was a moment of tense silence before Mr. Chen responded, understood. Moving to position B. Be careful, little one. The nickname brought a slight smile to her face. Mr. Chen had called her that since she was a child, learning to shoot cans off fence posts under her grandfather's watchful eye. Now, those lessons would finally serve their true purpose. She moved through the shadows like a ghost, her boots silent on the pavement. The festival decorations provided perfect cover, creating patches of shadow between the strung-up lights. As she approached the bank's side entrance, Rose could hear the faint sounds of professional thieves at work, the subtle clicks of picks on locks, the soft beep of disabled security systems. What they didn't know was that Rose had spent the past week adding her own modifications to the bank's security system. Every camera they thought they'd disabled was still streaming to Mr. Chen's command center. Every door they'd unlocked had triggered a silent alert. They thought they were in control, but they were walking into a trap of Rose's design. The night air carried the scent of autumn leaves and fresh-cut hay, mingling with the lingering aromas from the festival preparations. Rose took a deep breath, centering herself just as her grandfather had taught her. In her mind, she could hear his voice, "The moment before action is sacred. Use it wisely." Through her earpiece, she heard the synchronized movements of Mr. Chen's team taking their positions. Years of training, countless hours of preparation, and generations of protecting this community had led to this moment. The gang thought they were dealing with simple country folk, easy targets for their sophisticated operation. In a few minutes, they would learn just how wrong they were. Rose checked her equipment one final time, then keyed her radio. "All units in position." The responses came back in whispered affirmatives. She took one last look at the harvest moon hanging above the town square, its golden light illuminating the scene like nature's spotlight. Operation is go. I repeat, operation is go. The time for watching and waiting was over. Now, the farm girl they'd underestimated would show them exactly what she was capable of. The moment Rose slipped through the bank's side entrance, time seemed to shift into a different rhythm. Moonlight filtered through the high windows, casting marble-like patterns across the polished floor. The familiar space, where she'd done her banking since childhood, had transformed into a battlefield of shadows and whispered movements. Her boots, specially modified with silent soles, made no sound as she moved through the darkened corridor. Ahead, she could hear the gang working on the vault, their whispered communications echoing softly off the walls. The sound of their equipment cases being opened reminded her of summer storms rolling across the valley, a quiet that preceded something powerful. Through her earpiece, Mr. Chen's voice came in clear but hushed. "They've started setting up the explosive charges. Team 2 is in position at the rear exit." Rose acknowledged with a soft click of her radio, her mind already mapping out the next phase of their plan. The gang had positioned lookouts exactly where she'd predicted, their military training making them both formidable and predictable. From her position behind a marble column, Rose could see the fake security guard still at his post, his hand hovering near his concealed weapon. What caught her attention was the way he kept checking his watch. They were operating on a precise timeline. Her grandfather had taught her that timing was everything in operations like this, but he'd also taught her how to disrupt someone else's carefully laid plans. The vault area was now illuminated by the gang's portable work lights, creating an island of brightness in the darkness. Rose counted 6 men, each moving with the precision of seasoned professionals. Their leader, the man they called Chief, was directing the placement of the explosives with hand signals that confirmed her suspicions about their military background. What they hadn't noticed was the subtle change in air pressure as Rose's team sealed off their escape routes one by one. The ventilation system, which she had modified days ago, was now working to their advantage, carrying the sound of their movements away from the gang's position. It was a trick she'd learned from one of her grandfather's old case files. Controlling the environment was as important as controlling the situation. The festival decorations visible through the windows cast shifting patterns across the scene, creating an almost dreamlike quality. But Rose remained sharply focused, every sense attuned to her surroundings. She could feel the slight vibration in the floor as the gang moved heavy equipment into position, could smell the distinct odor of the explosive compounds they were using. Suddenly, one of the gang members paused, his head tilting slightly. "Something's not right," he whispered to Chief. The leader stopped his work on the vault, and for a moment, the only sound was the gentle hum of their equipment. Rose held her breath, knowing that this was the crucial moment, the instant when doubt could either expose their operation or play right into her hands. Chief raised his hand, signaling for complete silence. In that stillness, Rose made her move, not toward them, but away, deliberately letting her boot scuff ever so slightly against the floor. The sound was faint, but in the tension-filled quiet, it might as well have been a thunderclap. "Check it out," Chief ordered, sending 2 men to investigate. Rose smiled in the darkness. They were now operating on her timeline, not theirs. As the men moved cautiously toward the sound, they were unknowingly walking into carefully positioned crossfire zones that she and Mr. Chen had mapped out days ago. Through the windows, the harvest moon cast long shadows that seemed to dance across the marble floors. Rose could see the growing uncertainty in the gang members' movements, the slight hesitation in their steps, the way they held their weapons just a little tighter. They were starting to realize that something was wrong, but they couldn't quite put their finger on what. The next few moments would require perfect timing. Rose reached into her pocket and withdrew a small device her grandfather had modified years ago, a simple tool that could create the illusion of movement in multiple locations simultaneously. As she activated it, soft sounds began emanating from different corners of the bank, nothing dramatic, just subtle suggestions of presence that would force the gang to divide their attention. Chief's voice cut through the darkness. "Something's not right here. Pack it up. We're aborting." But Rose knew it was already too late for them. Their own protocols would now work against them. They'd have to retrieve their equipment, ensure they left no evidence, maintain their formation. All of this would take precious minutes during which her team would be moving into their final positions. The night air had grown cooler, and Rose could feel the slight chill through her tactical vest. The familiar weight of her grandfather's modified service weapon provided a steady comfort as she prepared for the next phase. Years of training, countless hours of preparation, and generations of protecting this community had led to this moment. Through her earpiece, she heard Mr. Chen's calm voice, "All units ready. Waiting for your signal, little one." Rose took a deep breath, feeling the convergence of everything her grandfather had taught her: patience, strategy, and the understanding that true strength often lay in being underestimated. The gang was about to learn that their worst mistake wasn't choosing to rob this bank, or even choosing this town. Their worst mistake was dismissing the quiet farm girl who'd spent her whole life preparing for a moment exactly like this. As she keyed her radio to give the signal, Rose allowed herself one last thought of her grandfather. He would have been proud to see how his lessons were about to be put to use. The harvest moon hung witness in the sky as Rose's voice, clear and confident, broke the tension-filled silence. "Execute Plan Delta. All units go." The world erupted into orchestrated chaos the moment Rose gave the signal. Like a perfectly conducted symphony, every element of her plan began to play its part. The bank's emergency lights suddenly blazed to life, but not in their usual pattern. Instead, they pulsed in a disorienting sequence that Rose had specially programmed. The gang's night vision equipment, which they'd been relying on, became instantly useless. In the first few seconds of confusion, Rose's voice rang out through the bank's speaker system, another modification she'd made days ago: "This is your only warning. You're surrounded, and all exits are covered. Surrender now." Her tone carried the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, a tone that made even hardened criminals pause. Chief's response was immediate and predictable. "Push through the east exit. Now," he commanded, exactly as Rose had anticipated. The gang's training would compel them to move as a unit, to fight their way out through what appeared to be the weakest point in the perimeter. But the east exit was exactly where Rose wanted them to go. The gang moved with professional precision, even in their surprise. Their formation was textbook perfect, which made them perfectly predictable. As they approached the east exit, Rose activated the next phase of her plan. The heavy fire doors, which they disabled earlier, suddenly slammed shut with a resounding boom. The sound echoed through the marble halls like a church bell tolling. Through the chaos, Rose moved like a shadow come to life. Her grandfather had taught her that movement in combat should be like water, flowing, adaptable, and impossible to grasp. She positioned herself behind a massive oak desk, watching as the gang's coordinated response began to fracture under the pressure of the unexpected. the fake security guard made the first serious mistake. Panicking, he broke formation and ran toward what he thought was a hidden exit behind the teller stations. Instead, he found himself face to face with Mr. Chen, whose quiet presence had all the force of a mountain. The guard's surrender was almost silent, just a soft clatter as his weapon hit the floor. Chief's voice cut through the confusion, still commanding but with an edge of desperation, "Fall back to the vault. Defensive positions." But even as he gave the order, Rose's next surprise was unfolding. The vault area, which had been their center of operations, was now filling with a dense, harmless but disorienting fog, another of her grandfather's old tactics, modified for this exact scenario. In the swirling mist, illuminated by the strobing emergency lights, the scene took on an almost dreamlike quality. Rose could see the gang members' silhouettes, their movements becoming increasingly uncertain. The cool night air flowing through the ventilation system carried the scent of autumn leaves, mixing strangely with the metallic tang of their abandoned equipment. Two of the gang members, their military training evident in their movements, attempted to set up a defensive position using the heavy equipment cases as cover. Rose allowed herself a small smile. Those cases, which they thought would protect them, had been slowly leaking their bottled air supply for the past 20 minutes, thanks to tiny punctures she'd made earlier. Their compressed air tanks, meant for their vault operation, were now nearly empty. Through her earpiece, Rose heard the synchronized movements of her team. Mr. Chen's voice came through, calm as ever, "West side secured. 3 contained." The old man had lost none of his skill, his years of experience proving more valuable than raw strength or speed. Chief, realizing his carefully planned operation was unraveling, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Detonate the charges," he ordered. "If we're going down, we're taking this whole place with us." But Rose had been waiting for this moment. As the gang leader reached for the detonator, he found himself grasping at empty air. The detonator, along with the firing pins from their explosives, had been carefully removed and replaced with harmless duplicates during their earlier confusion. The harvest moon's light still streamed through the high windows, creating surreal patterns in the swirling fog. Rose moved through this ethereal landscape with practiced grace, her boots silent on the marble floor. She could hear the growing frustration in the gang members' voices as they realized every option, every backup plan, every escape route had been anticipated and countered. In the ghostly light, Rose caught a glimpse of her reflection in one of the bank's glass partitions. For a moment, she saw herself as others would, not just the farm girl they'd underestimated, but a guardian of her community, carrying on her grandfather's legacy. The denim jacket over her tactical vest somehow looked more appropriate than ever. Chief, his military training evident in his refusal to give up, suddenly spotted Rose through the fog. Recognition dawned in his eyes as he realized who had orchestrated their downfall. "The farm girl," he said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. "It was you all along." Rose stepped forward, her grandfather's modified service weapon held steady. "You made 3 mistakes," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the mist. "You underestimated this town, you underestimated the people who protect it, and most importantly." She paused, allowing herself a small smile, "You underestimated a farm girl who learned from the best." The sound of multiple weapons being readied echoed through the bank as the rest of Rose's team emerged from their positions. The gang members, finally understanding the completeness of their defeat, began laying down their weapons one by one. The operation that had terrorized 3 states was ending not with a bang, but with the quiet surrender of professionals who knew they'd been outplayed. As Mr. Chen began coordinating with local law enforcement for the arrests, Rose looked up through the high windows at the harvest moon. Its light seemed to approve of the night's events, casting a gentle glow over the scene. In the distance, she could hear the first stirrings of the town awakening, preparing for a festival that would now be a true celebration. Dawn broke over Pine Valley like a watercolor painting coming to life, soft pinks and golds washing away the darkness of the night's events. As the first rays of sunlight touched the bank's facade, they illuminated a scene that would become legend in the small farming community. Law enforcement vehicles lined the street, their lights casting rotating patterns that mixed with the early morning mist. Rose stood on the bank's steps, watching as the last of the gang members was led away in handcuffs. Chief, his military bearing still evident despite his defeat, paused as he passed her. "I've been doing this for 15 years, he said quietly, a mix of respect and regret in his voice. "Never once did I think we'd be taken down by a farmer." Rose merely nodded, her grandfather's teachings echoing in her mind. Victory needs no explanation, defeat allows no alibis. The morning dew sparkled on the festival decorations that still hung throughout the town square, unchanged by the night's drama. Market stalls stood ready for the day's celebrations, their autumn displays of pumpkins and corn stalks creating a striking contrast to the serious faces of the FBI agents now documenting the scene. The town was waking up to a story that would be told for generations. Mr. Chen approached, his weathered face showing both pride and exhaustion. "Your grandfather," he said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, "he always said you would surprise everyone someday. Though I doubt even he could have imagined this." He gestured to the bank, where forensics teams were carefully cataloging the gang's sophisticated equipment and Rose's equally sophisticated countermeasures. The local troublemakers who had so often mocked Rose were there too, having arrived early to set up their festival booth. Their faces showed a mixture of shock and awe as they watched FBI agents interviewing the farm girl they'd underestimated for so long. One of them, gathering his courage, approached Rose with an awkward shuffle. We didn't know," he stammered, his usual bravado replaced with genuine remorse. "All this time, you were actually—" Rose cut him off with a gentle smile. "I was exactly who I appeared to be," she said. "A farmer who loves this land and these people enough to protect them." The simple truth in her words seemed to affect him more than any anger could have. As the morning progressed, the festival began to take shape around the investigation scene. Local farmers arrived with their produce, setting up their stalls while stealing glances at the bank. The smell of fresh-baked bread from the bakery mixed with the crisp autumn air, creating a surreal blend of normalcy and extraordinary circumstance. The town's children, excited by the unusual activity, gathered at the edges of the police tape, their eyes wide with wonder. Rose overheard one small girl whisper to another, "See? I told you farmers were superheroes too." The comment brought an unexpected warmth to Rose's heart, reminding her of her own childhood dreams of making a difference. Inside the bank, Rose walked through the aftermath with the FBI's lead investigator, explaining the intricacies of her plan. The agent, a veteran of countless operations, shook her head in amazement at the elegant simplicity of Rose's countermeasures. "You turned their own training against them," she noted, studying the modified ventilation system. "That's something we don't see often." The vault area, now cleared of the gang's equipment, still bore traces of the night's events. Rose's fog machine had left a thin film on the marble floors, creating patterns that looked almost like frost in the morning light. The agent paused by the vault door, examining the fake detonator that had given Rose's team the crucial advantage. This wasn't just about stopping a robbery, the agent observed, her keen eyes studying Rose. This was about protecting a way of life. Rose nodded, running her hand along the familiar walls of the bank where she'd done business since childhood. "Every farmer knows," she replied, "you don't just protect the harvest. You protect the ground it grows from." Outside, the festival was now in full swing, the community refusing to let the night's events overshadow their celebration. The scent of kettle corn and apple cider filled the air, mixing with the earthy smell of fresh produce and fall flowers. Children ran between the stalls, their laughter a reminder of why the night's risks had been necessary. Rose's farm truck, still parked behind the feed store, had drawn the attention of several FBI technical experts. They marveled at the modifications she'd made, the silent engine, the hidden compartments, the sophisticated communication equipment. One agent commented that it was better equipped than some of their own vehicles. Mr. Chen found Rose by her truck, handed her a cup of fresh coffee from the diner. "The FBI wants to recruit you, you know," he said with a knowing smile. "They're impressed by what you've done here." Rose took a sip of the coffee, enjoying its familiar warmth. "I already have a job," she replied, looking out over the festival crowds. "This land, these people, they're my responsibility now, just like they were grandfathers." The autumn breeze carried the sound of the town bell, ringing out the hour just as it had for generations. Rose closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the sun on her face and listening to the mixture of festival sounds and police radios. In that moment, she felt profoundly connected to every farmer who had ever stood guard over their community, every protector who had been underestimated, every guardian who had chosen to serve in their own quiet way. The local newspaper photographer, capturing the scene for posterity, asked Rose to pose for a photo. She stood there in her work boots and tactical vest, the festival decorations and police lights behind her, embodying both the protector and the protected. In her pocket, her grandfather's journal seemed to carry a special weight, its pages now holding one more story of service and sacrifice. As the Harvest Festival reached its golden afternoon hours, Pine Valley had transformed into a scene that seemed to exist in two worlds at once. FBI agents mingled with farmers at food stalls, their dark suits standing out against the sea of flannel and denim. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the square, where children played between evidence markers that would soon be gone, leaving only memories and stories to be passed down. Rose sat on the old wooden bench outside the bank, the same bench where her grandfather used to rest during his patrol days. The manila envelope in her hands contained the official commendation from the FBI, recognition of how her actions had not only saved the bank but had also brought down a criminal organization that had terrorized rural communities across 3 states. Yet her eyes were drawn not to the official papers, but to the simpler sight of her community celebrating life's continuity. The local troublemakers who had once mocked her had undergone their own transformation. As Rose watched, they helped an elderly farmer unload her truck, handling her prized pumpkins with unexpected care. One of them caught Rose's eye and offered a respectful nod, no words needed, just acknowledgement of how wrong first impressions could be. Mr. Chen approached, carrying 2 plates of Mrs. Thompson's famous apple pie from her festival booth. "Your grandfather," he said, settling beside her, "he used to say that the best victories are the ones that change hearts as well as circumstances." He handed her a plate, the warmth of the pie matching the warmth in his eyes. "Today, I think you've managed both." The afternoon light played through the festival bunting, creating dancing patterns on the ground that reminded Rose of the way moonlight had filtered through the bank windows during the previous night's confrontation. Those same windows now reflected the peaceful scene outside, the contrast as stark as the difference between who people thought she was and who she had proven herself to be. A young girl, no more than 7, approached Rose with wide eyes and determined steps. In her hands, she clutched a small toy tractor. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "That you're a farmer and a hero?" Rose set aside her pie and patted the bench beside her. "Want to know a secret?" she said as the girl climbed up. Being a farmer was always the more important part. The festival's live band had started playing in the gazebo, their folk music carrying across the square. Rose recognized the tune, an old song about the changing of seasons and the strength of community. It seemed fitting now, as she watched FBI technicians packing up their equipment while farmers hung the last of the harvest decorations. The lead FBI agent made her way through the crowd to where Rose sat. "We've finished processing everything," she said, her professional demeanor softening. "I have to admit, in 20 years of service, I've never seen anything quite like this. You turned an entire town into a tactical advantage without anyone realizing it." She paused, looking around at the festival. "And somehow, you managed to preserve everything worth protecting in the process." Rose stood, brushing pie crumbs from her jacket, still the same work-worn denim she'd always worn, now carrying a new kind of dignity. "Would you like to know how?" she asked, seeing the genuine curiosity in the agent's eyes. "My grandfather taught me that true strength isn't about changing who you are. It's about being exactly who you are, even when others don't see your value." As the afternoon began to fade into evening, the festival lights started twinkling to life. They mixed with the last rays of sunlight to create an almost magical atmosphere, as if the day itself was reluctant to end. The scent of wood smoke from the barbecue pits mingled with the sweet smell of late-blooming flowers, creating a symphony of autumn aromas that spoke of home and heritage. The town mayor, caught up in the spirit of the moment, had declared it Rose Miller Day, much to Rose's embarrassment and the town's delight. But as she walked through the festival grounds, what touched her most weren't the grand gestures or official recognition. It was the small moments, a farmer teaching his daughter to recognize good soil, a group of children playing at being both farmers and heroes, the troublemakers helping set up tables for the evening's community dinner. At sunset, Rose made her way back to her farm, leaving the celebration behind. The drive home felt different somehow, as if the familiar road was acknowledging a change in its traveler. Her grandfather's old truck hummed beneath her, still carrying its hidden modifications but now feeling more like a badge of honor than a secret to be kept. As she crested the final hill, her farmhouse came into view, silhouetted against the evening sky. The porch light was on, she'd left it on that morning, a lifetime ago. Her fields stretched out around the house, the crops swaying gently in the evening breeze, unaware that their guardian had become a legend. Rose parked beside the barn and took a moment to look up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow, she would be back to her regular routine, feeding animals, checking crops, maintaining equipment. The FBI would finish their investigation, the festival decorations would come down, and Pine Valley would return to its quiet rhythms. But something fundamental had shifted, like the turning of seasons or the changing of tides. The town had seen that strength could wear muddy boots, that heroes could smell of hay and honest work, that protection could come from the most unexpected sources. More importantly, they had been reminded that a community's real wealth lay not in its bank vault, but in the hearts and hands of those who called it home. Inside her house, Rose took her grandfather's journal from her pocket and added her own entry, not about the dramatic events of the night, but about the simple truth she'd learned, that being underestimated was not a weakness but an opportunity, that being genuine was its own kind of strength, and that sometimes the best way to protect what you love is to simply be who you are, quietly and completely. As the night settled over Pine Valley, the harvest moon rose once again, its light touching everything with silver. Rose stood on her porch, listening to the nighttime sounds of her farm, the same sounds that had always been there, now carrying the weight of a story that would be told for generations. In the distance, the festival lights still twinkled, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary moments come wrapped in the most ordinary packages.